God Venervelden, or good evening, friends. I'm Signe Boehm, actually Signe Torsdaler Newstrom Boehm, if you want to be specific. I know what you're thinking. Man, what a mouthful. Oh yeah, I'm originally from Norway, where the naming traditions were very different than what we're used to. So let me break it down for you. Signe is my first name, chosen by my parents. Traditionally, our second name is the name of our father and our relationship to him. In my case, my father's name was Torstein. Datter, D-A-T-T-E-R, is Norwegian for daughter. So my second name is Torstein daughter, literally Torstein's daughter. My brother's second name was Torstein Sen, meaning Torstein's son. My third name is the area where I was born, Nilstrud. Boehm is my married name, of course. Now, when I look at this and I think of all the names, Johnson, Thompson,
Yes.
S-E-N is Norwegian, S-O-N is, I don't know, some other flavor. I know that sounds very complicated, but that's just how things were done in the old country. It's rather helpful for doing my family history research if you're lucky enough to have strong Norwegian roots. Anyway, now that I've introduced myself, I can tell you a little about my life. As you probably guessed, I was born in Norway, September 21st, 1888. It was an idyllic childhood, but not such a fun adolescence. It was hard to find work as a young woman. Many people had probably what you think of as old-fashioned ideas about women's roles. At that time, lots of people were immigrating to the United States. My family thought that was an absolutely crazy idea and nobody was going to go willing to do the journey with me. Did I let that stop me? Of course not. I came here on my own in 1911. But my trip could very easily have ended in tragedy. I sailed on the maiden voyage of the Olympic. Maybe you've heard of that ship. If not, you definitely know her sister ship, the Titanic. In fact, the captain of the Olympic when I was aboard was the very same man who captained the Titanic when she went down less than a year after my trip. Just imagine, if I had chosen to leave a few months later, I might have been aboard the Titanic. My crossing was safe, but I always felt a little spooky about how close I came to disaster. My first stop upon reaching America was Ellis Island. It was unlike anything I had ever seen in Norway. There were so many people, all of them speaking different languages. There were interpreters for most languages, so that was helpful. We had to pass a medical test and then a primary inspection. There were so many questions. I truly lost part of myself in the process. I arrived as Signe Torsteindotter Nilstrud. I left Ellis Island as Signe Thompson. It wasn't my choice. Like many immigrants, my name was changed to make it easier for me to adapt to my new home country. But I vowed to remember my Norwegian traditions. I found my way to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and I started work at a local shoe factory. I quickly discovered it really wasn't the kind of work for me. I was more interested in caring for people, and I loved to cook. I considered teaching or nursing, but I knew I wouldn't be happy doing either one of those. Eventually, I was hired as a cook for a wealthy family. The Davis family was originally from Neenah. William was the son of John Davis, who ran the Winnebago paper mill. After his death, William and his brother took over the mill, but eventually sold it to Diedrich Bergstrom in the early 1900s. William had already purchased a paper mill in Eau Claire, so he moved there full time, but his heart still belonged to Neenah. He loved to visit and spending time with family and going sailing. In fact, he owned a summer house over on Limekiln Point. I first came to Neenah on one of Mr. Davis's trips. Apparently, he didn't want to leave home without my cooking. I traveled with the family and spent the summer with them in Neenah. I was so impressed with the area, and after being completely honest, even more impressed with the handsome man who was taking care of the grounds at the Davis home. He was George Boehm. He was born in Menasha, but his family had moved to Neenah for many years. By 1910, he was living on Smith Street, right across from the most unique house that was shaped like an octagon. Have you seen it? Yes, the Neenah Historical Society is now located there. Anyway, George and I married on December 18th, 1915. After our marriage, I stopped working for the Davis family, but we still saw them a lot. George continued to care for the grounds and of their home, and we spent time with them whenever they came to Neenah. We loved boating and enjoying meals at the Limekiln Roadhouse. At least we did for a time. You see, it was at that house that the greatest tragedy of my life occurred. My second son, Chester, was born in 1918. He was such a fun little boy. He loved tagging along with his older brother, George Jr. On May 28th, 1921, we were at the Davis home with the boys and our new baby son, Robert. A group of us were on the houseboat. Chester and George Jr. were playing on the deck. I turned my back for just a second, and Chester disappeared. As you can imagine, I was absolutely frantic. My dear husband eventually found Chester floating in the water. He brought the boy to shore and tried to save him, but it was too late. Chester passed that day, but there wasn't a day in my life that I didn't remember him. George and I would eventually have 3 sons, but I never forgot my lost boy. After the tragedy, I had to get away for a time. I decided to go back to Norway to heal. I took my baby, Robert, and we arrived in October of 1925. I spent 2 months there, recovering and visiting old friends and family members. It was a time I truly cherished, but it also reminded me of my beloved family back in America. When I was ready, I returned stateside. Have you heard of the Boehm family? You might remember their meat market. My husband was one of 9 children of Joseph and Anna Boehm. His brother Charles was a butcher and started work at the Kepsel store on Wisconsin Avenue in the 1920s. The store name changed to Kepsel and Boehm, and you'll never believe how Charles ended up owning the store outright. Family legend says that Charles intended to buy money he needed to buy out the Kepsels from the bank. On that fateful day, he asked his wife. His wife asked how much he needed. So he told her. She turned right around, left the room, and came back with a box stuffed with money. She handed over the exact amount he needed, and he was dumbfounded. Maggie, that was Charles' wife, was well known as a great saver, but no one knew just how much she was really holding on to. She really saved the day. Charles owned the store until he retired in the 1940s. He turned things over to his son Howard, only to have to go back to work when the U.S. entered World War II and Howard was called up to serve. Luckily, Howard returned safely and Charles was able to retire again. Howard's family ran the store all the way until the 1980s, first at 109 West Wisconsin Avenue and then later at the larger location of 203 West Wisconsin. I remember all the great tasting meat and sausages they had, especially on Sausage Thursdays. Howard wasn't the only member of the family who had to serve during the war. My own sons did too. George Jr. and Robert were both drafted. I understood that it was necessary, and I was proud of their service, but it was a difficult time too. Everyone who had a son in service was terrified. Luckily, both of my boys made it home. In fact, George Jr. and Robert would go on to open a business together, Boehm Electric. My youngest son, Richard, was the first person in our family to attend and graduate from college. He attended St. Olaf College in Minnesota and then went on to the Institute of Paper Chemistry in Appleton and then to Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He worked at Kimberly-Clark for many, many years. As for me, having kids and grandchildren gave me the chance to share my Norwegian heritage. Mainly, I did this through cooking and sharing my old world recipes. George and I were really looking forward to our golden years, and once he was able to retire in October 1954, he had been working as the caretaker of the J.R. Kimberly estate. Mr. Kimberly had purchased the old Davis estate and kept George on. Unfortunately, our long-desired time alone together was not to last. George died unexpectedly in February of 1955, 4 months. After that, I dedicated a lot of my time to church, where I had many friends. I also made another trip to Norway in 1958. I took my friend Albina Ilsing and my granddaughter Susan with me. We spent 6 weeks there. Susan got the chance to meet some of her relatives and had them tell her about her Norwegian heritage. We brought back several items which we used to educate others about our culture. The three of us hosted a tea at Our Savior's Lutheran Church in Neenah shortly after we got home. We shared stories from our trip and had some laughs. The ladies of the church were so supportive. Many of them had Scandinavian roots too, so that probably helped. Like a lot of people, I found life difficult as I grew older. Eventually, I moved to Wapaka and lived at the Bethany Lutheran Home starting in 1963. But I never forgot my adoptive hometown. When my life ended January 15th of 1970, I came back home to rest with my family right here in Neenah. 82 years. Thank you for letting me share my story. Yay!
I have to do two things at one time. This is tough on an old guy. Good evening, or as we say in Danish, good aften. My name is Jens Jersild. That's this guy. My great-grandfather. I was born in the lovely area of Jersild, Denmark, on March 21st, 1855. In Denmark, we follow the naming convention with our surnames being related to our father. My father was Niels Jensen, so my last name, as you see it here, was Nielsen, meaning son of Niels. I grew up in Denmark and for a while worked with my father on the farm. Everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, where am I? However, I decided to get a degree in the ministry from the University of Copenhagen and graduated in 1880. By that time, I found the most beautiful, loving woman, Laura Yeberg, and decided to marry her. There were many young men like me earning minister degrees in 80, so I decided that I needed to expand my horizons, and have to say that after someone who was ambitious and wanted to take some risks, and lucky for me, Laura was willing to come along. A couple of days after the two of us were married, we set sail for America to become a pastor in the Chicago area. And the trip to America was when I made the name change as well. When we got to America, I thought my name Nielsen was too common with all the Danish immigrants, so I decided to change my name to the beautiful village I left behind named Jersild. Once Laura and I got to America, we started ministering to the new Danish immigrants in America. At first we were in Chicago, but then in 1886 we had a call from Alden, Minnesota that was fine with lots of Scandinavian people, but wasn't quite right. In 1889 we called to serve the Danish Lutheran Church in this place called Neenah, Wisconsin. I had not heard about this place, but I was willing to try one more change of scenery. Laura and our three oldest sons and I moved to Neenah, and our first church was on the corner of Isabella and Adams Street. That was the first church. You know where that is?
Is it still there?
Yeah, the building is still standing, and I think it's called the Faith Apartments. Neenah is a great city, and it was back then too. There are all these local paper mills, and it got me to thinking the Danish population in America needs to be better informed on what's going on in America and back in the old country. Plus, wouldn't it be nice to have a newspaper in the language especially for the language for new immigrants learning English. I decided it was a great idea and founded the Danish weekly newspaper called Danskerten in 1892. It was a component of my Jersild publishing company, which published the newspaper and other books in Danish, German, and English. Our little newspaper shared articles and discussions from both sides of the issue being presented. There were some church leaders here that didn't like some of my views. While the newspaper had circulation of 2,300 subscribers, I didn't like all of it either. I stepped down as pastor of the Neenah Church in 1987. In 1999, I ended up selling the newspaper and the publishing business and went to Blair, Nebraska, which at the time was the home of the Trinity Cemetery of the United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. After all these issues with the publishing company and newspaper, I desperately needed a break. The following spring, I went back to Denmark. I wanted to visit with my family back home, but by the time I went for the visit, Lauren and I had 9 children, and unfortunately one passed away. I was having some trouble making ends meet with the family the size of a pastor's salary or as a publisher. But I knew I needed to do something in order to keep my family alive. From my trip, I bought 2 small knitting machines and the knowledge of how to use them. At first, I was making mittens, socks, and sweaters to keep my family warm during these long winters in cold Wisconsin weather. However, the people in the community soon noticed the high-quality items I was producing and got another idea. I thought it would produce enough items that I could potentially sell them to friends and neighbors. That's just what I did. In 1901, Jersild Knitting Company was incorporated, and we acquired land on North Commercial Street and purchased the old St. Patrick's Schoolhouse and moved that building to North Commercial Street to serve as our factory. We also purchased a home on East Wisconsin Avenue, big enough for Laura and me and our 10 children. The knitting mill ended up being our most successful investment. We had as many as 20 knitting machines in operation. Production eventually expanded to include any type of garment that could be knit. We employed many people in Neenah for many years, including many young women. We were able to offer young women decent wages and good working conditions. Being successful businessmen in the early 1900s, in most cases meant that you had an opportunity, or shall I say an obligation, to run for office. In 1913, I was elected to the city council. I was happy to serve my fellow citizens and wanted to do my best to improve their lives. In later years, I would be approached to run for mayor, but that wasn't really something I was interested in. I served as a city councilman through 1917, and it was a change of years for me. After I resigned from being pastor in Neenah, I became an unpaid pastor for a congregation in Oconto, Wisconsin. Excuse me. I celebrated 25 years of service with that congregation in Oconto in May of 1914. I also decided to take Laura on a trip back to Denmark to do some traveling in Europe. I was part of a group from the University of New York studying civic and industrial problems and solutions. I was also looking forward to learning about how European cities were solving local problems and doing some sightseeing. We arrived in Europe in early June 1914. We were able to visit Norway, Sweden, and our beloved Denmark. We were set to go to Germany when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand happened, and the whole lot of unrest was stirring the rest of the time in Europe. It was much easier. We decided the best place for us would to be returned to home, but it was much easier said than done, however. It was difficult to secure passage on an American ship back to the U.S. I think the initial voyage from Denmark to America in 1885 was much more enjoyable than the one in 1914. Neither were all that pleasant. Fortunately, Laura and I eventually made it back home, but that's not all that's happened in 1914. I also applied for a fire escape patent. I purchased the equipment during a trip abroad from my relatives. In October 1914, I had equipment model exhibited at the Jersild Knitting Company on Commercial Street. We had a huge crowd gathered on the 30th of October, which watched us test. It worked perfectly. My patent enabled us to produce landscapes in the United States, or land escapes in the United States and Canada. This project ended up not being very successful, but in business that's the way it goes sometimes. One last event occurred in 1914, right before Christmas no less. There was an unfortunate tragedy in the warehouse for the knitting mill. We had a fire, and it was a large one. The total damage was $35,000, which today would be $900,000. A policeman noticed it around 2 o'clock in the morning, and the Neenah and Menasha firefighters came to put the fire out. Fortunately, the fire was in the old part of the warehouse, so we could keep working the following day. Luckily, 1915 was much better. I purchased a piece of property out on Lake Winnebago. The property was formerly farmland owned by Arthur Payne. Today, you might recognize that property as Payne's Point. I loved that property. I set up a little garden out there. It was perfect to get out of the city and clear my mind, working the land just like we were back in Denmark. I went out there on May 10th, 1917 to work. I put in quite a few hours that day, and around 4 a.m. I took out my watch and checked the time. Then my heart gave out, and that was it. I was working with a young man, the son of a man who I leased property to, who ran home to get my son and the doctor. But by the time they got there, it was too late. My death was a shock to the city. I came to know. I had attended many of Neenah's citizens' weddings and funerals, speaking at most of them. My funeral was no means the largest, but there were many different people, even young men who witnessed my death were there, leading the funeral procession at the cemetery. He left a trail of flowers along the way. It was a beautiful tribute. I'm buried with so many people in my family. That's him. Where are we going? Speaking of family, they kept our business at the Jersild Knitting Company running. There were large expansions at the mill after my death, and I think the building still stands on North Commercial Street. I understand the company eventually became one of the largest knitwear producers in the nation. For me, it was fun to think about everyone out wearing our warm Danish sweaters, and maybe even some of you who have come out here tonight know about my sweaters.
I got one still.
What's that?
I still got one.
There you go. That's it.
Guten Abend, as we say in German. In English, that means good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. You'll have to excuse me. I'm a little shy. I'm not used to having people around, but I did put on my Sunday best just for you. And I'm so thrilled that you're here today to hear my story. That's pretty marvelous. And it is an interesting story, if I do say so myself. In fact, I've got a lot of notes, so I don't forget to tell you anything. But first, the basics. My name is Elizabeth Meyer, and I was born in Meadsville, Pennsylvania on May 31st, 1866. Now I know what you're thinking. Tonight's experience is all about the immigration experience, so how can I possibly contribute to the immigration experience when I'm an American citizen? Just you wait. You won't believe it. I'm going to tell you how this sweet girl from Pennsylvania turned into an enemy of the American government. And in just a few words. My parents, Andrew and Mary, were common people. They were immigrants from Germany at a time when many immigrants were arriving on American shores. It was difficult to find jobs on the crowded East Coast, so they headed west. My parents, myself, and my 6 siblings ended up in Wisconsin, where jobs were more plentiful. Laborers were in high demand in the 1870s. Traditional work, like at the flour mills, was available, and there were exciting new opportunities when the paper mills and the foundries started up. My father was a laborer, so he fit right into the Neenah community. My mother, like many women of the time, stayed home to raise her children. We had a home near Main Street. We were never alone. There were people arriving from the East Coast daily, and they were also arriving from places like Germany, Ireland, and Wales. Neenah catered to the immigrant community with all of their groups and gathering places. Take the Schutzen Hall, for example. It opened in the fall of 1875. It was built by a group of German immigrant men known as the Schützenbund. They formed a benevolent society, which basically is a group that helped out bereaved or disabled families following a death in the family. The hall was designed as a place for immigrants to go to socialize with a little taste of the old country. It hosted speakers, entertainment shows, and community dances. It even hosted high school graduations. It was a great building. It was close to downtown near the clock tower, and Main Hall was right in the heart of Neenah. But it burned down in 1892 and was never rebuilt. But it was the focal point of Neenah while it lasted. German immigrants also felt right at home in Schutzen Park. It was located right along Lake Winnebago. So if you're thinking where Rec Park is, maybe a little south of that, every Sunday German families would travel to the park for picnics and socializing. They were hard-working people, but they loved to have fun, no matter what some city leaders felt. You see, one city leader, and I can't remember his name anymore, decided that beer had no place in the park. Can you believe it? A fresh from the East Coast transplant trying to prevent a bunch of German immigrants from drinking beer in their park. Anyway, that city leader declared that deliveries, beer deliveries, could not be made to the park using main roads. So there was no way for beer to get to Schutzen Park. Now, as you probably know, Germans are great problem solvers, and they're a little bit creative too. They weren't going to let a little rule get in their way. So Henry Lawden came to the rescue. He owned a farm on what was then the south side of Neenah. He put up the money to build a road that went straight into Schutzen Park, so beer could be delivered without setting foot on a main road. They got around that rule easily enough. They called the new street Lawden Boulevard, and it still exists today from the Oak Street, Grove Street area all the way to the park. Anyway, back to my story. I enjoyed growing up in Neenah and eventually met a young German immigrant named John Meyer, who would become my husband on April 29th, 1886. We moved into a little house on Hewitt Street on Doty Island. Well, that little house got crowded before too long. We had 7 children. John was a millwright working in the paper mills. He worked at the John Strange and the Whiting mills. He was a millwright for over 30 years. Now let's get to my immigration experience. As I said, I was born in the United States. However, my beloved John was a German immigrant. It didn't matter much when we were first married. There were a lot of immigrants here then. But in 1917, that all changed. As you know, World War I brought out the worst in a lot of people. Suddenly, immigrants, especially German immigrants, like John, were not to be trusted. When President Wilson declared war on Germany, he established special requirements for what he called enemy aliens. Basically, any male German immigrant who had not completed the naturalization process. You guessed it, that included my John. He didn't have his paperwork, but it really wasn't his fault. You see, John was an immigrant with his family from Germany when he was just a child. His parents didn't fill out the paperwork to become citizens, and John didn't realize he needed the paperwork. After all, he grew up in Wisconsin. He considered himself to be a Wisconsinite through and through. Not so according to the government. In 1918, any German person who hadn't been born in the United States and who had not completed the naturalization process had to register as an enemy alien. At first it was just men, but eventually women were included too. John had to register. So, how did I become an enemy alien, you ask? Well, you see, back then, a woman was considered an extension of her husband, and that applied to immigration status as well. According to the government, I lost my status as a United States citizen the moment I married John. I was born in Pennsylvania, but my status changed to match my husband's as soon as I said, I do. He was an enemy alien, and so was I. If an immigrant didn't register and they were found out, they could be fined or possibly sent to jail. So, John and I dutifully registered. We had to take our photographs and go to the police station. They asked us a ton of questions. They took our fingerprints, and eventually we got our registration cards. It's a picture of my registration card photo. But it was more than just the paperwork. Because of the war, anti-German sentiment was high. Enemy aliens were not treated very well, even in Neenah. There were restrictions on where we could go and if we could even own firearms. But the worst part was people's attitudes. They were suspicious of everything we did. Even if we were just out being part of the community, minding our own business, we felt constantly watched. There was a silver lining to the situation, though. It made John extremely motivated to file his naturalization paperwork. He filed in 1918, but he wasn't the only one. In fact, so many people filed that it took until October of 1923 for his paperwork to be complete. At that point, he was considered a United States citizen, and my citizen status was reinstated as well. War affected everyone, including our family, not just because of the immigration status. John's birthplace caused him and I hardship, but what's worse is it didn't spare us any heartache. You see, we had 3 sons, all born in Wisconsin. It's difficult for me to understand this even now, how it happened. But John and I considered ourselves good, upstanding citizens. The government disagreed and decided that because of out-of-date paperwork, we were in fact enemy aliens. But being the son of a so-called enemy alien did not keep John Jr. from having to serve in the United States military. No, sir, can you believe it? We were not considered citizens, but our son was enough of a citizen to be sent to fight. Thankfully, John Jr. returned home safely and lived a long life in Neenah. In fact, each of my children lived a long and fulfilling life. I'm very lucky to be able to say that. Not many people can. My daughter, Laura, ended up being in California as a private nurse. But before that, she worked at the Jersild Knitting Company, making sweaters alongside many other Neenah women. I'm hoping that you heard Jens Jersild speak tonight. He has a very interesting story. After the war, John and I continued our quiet life in Neenah. He was part of the Fraternal Order of Eagles, and I was involved in the James Hawley American Legion Post. We were both members of the First Evangelical Church. I so enjoyed spending time in the community, but one thing I did not enjoy was trains. That seems odd, doesn't it? I actually developed a phobia where trains are concerned, and it's because of some terrifying experiences. Both of my parents died in train accidents. 2 separate incidents, mind you. What are the odds of that? Back in 1898, before the hospital was built, my father was walking on the sidewalk by the Central Railroad. We're not sure exactly what happened, but he slipped and fell. His internal injuries were so severe that without any medical care, he passed away a few days later. 20 years later, in 1917, my mother decided to visit her friend on East Wisconsin Avenue. She had thought the 5:40 train had already passed through, but she was wrong. There were no crossing signals back then, so she didn't realize the train was coming until it was upon her. No one heard the train whistle blow for the warning either. She wasn't hit by the train, and I think she was so relieved that she wasn't hit that she failed to step back, and part of her dress got caught on the engine. You can imagine what happened after that. I shudder whenever I hear a train coming. John and I spent our remaining years with our children and grandchildren, celebrating 50 years of marriage prior to his death in 1937. I would follow on March 20th, 1942. But my family remains strong, and there are still some of my descendants living in the area contributing to the Neenah community. I'm sure when you stopped by tonight to hear my story, you wondered what a woman born in the United States could contribute to a discussion about the immigration experience. Can you believe there was a time when a woman's identity was so dependent on her husband that she took on his immigration status at marriage? That an American woman would somehow become an enemy alien in the eyes of the government just because she married a man whose paperwork wasn't updated? It seems laughable now, but that happened to so many women back then. Luckily for me, it all turned out okay. I'm hoping that you enjoyed the stories that you heard this evening, and I thank you very much for stopping by to hear mine. Don't be ashamed. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Henry Hewitt. It's a proud name. It was also my father's name and my son's name. I guess we Hewitts like that name a lot. I've worn many hats in my lifetime. Businessman, farmer, general store owner, community leader, husband, and father. And while I'm talking to you all here in Neenah, I devoted much of my life to your sister city, Menasha, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Like many of the other people who you will hear from tonight, I was not born in America. I came from humble origins. I was born in a farmhouse in Paythorne, Yorkshire. That's in northern England. And I was born on July 12th, 1814. Farming is in my blood. My mother, Millicent Lancaster, had grown up on a farm too. They called the farm the Windy Pike. Doesn't that sound lovely? I was the third of 7 children, so I have 2 older sisters, 3 younger brothers, and then a baby sister. Our small town was full of farmers, and our farm was surrounded by other farms. So, as you probably guessed, my brothers and I spent most of our days working the land, either on our farm or our neighbor's farm. There wasn't much in the way of educational opportunities, but we made do. Our close friends, the Proctor family, would become a part of my family. My sister Jane married Will Proctor, who was my father's right-hand man at our farm, and I married Will's younger sister, Mary. But I was tired of farm life, so when Mary's father offered me a job at his cotton mill, I jumped at the chance. I was 19 in 1835, with a new career and a new wife. That may sound strange to some of you, but that was quite common back then. Mary and I moved into a little house next to the mill, and less than a year later, our first child, a daughter, that we also named Mary, was born. Cotton milling was a very competitive business, so mill owners were always looking for the latest technology to set them apart. As a young guy, I got to work on the latest big thing, the power loom. While I learned a lot, I quickly realized that there was no room to better myself. You see, Mr. Proctor had 3 sons of his own, so a son-in-law did not rank very high. I knew if I wanted to make a name for myself, I'd have to do it on my own. It was a tough time for a lot of businesses in England and Ireland. Many people were talking about moving to America, where the land was cheap and jobs were plentiful. The American West was open for settlement, and I saw advertisements for the territories of Iowa and Wisconsin everywhere I went, including church and the pub. In 1841, the United States passed the Preemption Act, which basically allowed anyone who settled on government-owned land to purchase up to 160 acres of land for just $1.25 an acre. All they had to do was live on the land and improve it for 5 years. Then the land was theirs, free and clear. I was 27, and this sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. I had some savings and talked my brother Joe into coming as well. My wife, on the other hand, took a little more persuading, especially since we had 3 children at that time. She wasn't thrilled with the idea, but eventually she came around. We sailed from Liverpool to New York in the spring of 1842. From New York, we went west, mostly by steamer and canal boat. Eventually, we landed in Racine on the west shore of Lake Michigan. There was a settlement of Englishmen there, so we felt right at home. We built a log cabin, and Joe picked up right where he'd left off in England as a farmer. I was determined to do something different, though, so I left my family behind and went down to Chicago to help with the Michigan-Illinois Canal. I thought it would be a fast way to earn some money, since I still needed some before staking a land claim. The canal would link Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Our pay was barely enough to live on, especially since I was saving all I could and still supporting my family up north. Thanks to my experience working on machinery in the cotton mills in England, I was put in charge of a group of Irishmen. We were proud of our work, but in the end it left a really bad taste in our mouth because the contractor skipped town and took all of our wages with him. So I went back to farming. In 1845, and by the next year, I had earned enough money to claim 80 acres near Joe's farm. But honestly, I was not much of a farmer. I liked working in construction, like with the cotton mills and the canal, so I kept my ears open for new opportunity. And that came after Congress offered Wisconsin free federal land around the Fox River in order to improve navigation from De Pere to Lake Winnebago. They needed to build dams, bridges, canals, and locks. It was a lot of work and sounded like a steady job to me. Joe and I had had our claims for 5 years, so we were able to sell the land for quite a profit and head north. But there was one catch. Mary was pregnant again. Our son William was born in Racine County in June of 1848, but as soon as Mary could travel, we went north. In Green Bay, I was fortunate to find my fellow canal workers from Chicago. They must have all had the same idea, so we organized a crew. We made our proposal to the project manager and were soon building a wing dam at a little Indian village called Kakalin. You probably know it as Kokona. Eventually, we also received the contract to build a canal and lock on the north bank of the river. But the project ended up costing more cash than the government had on hand, so they asked if we would take the land or timber as payment. I didn't know it at the time, but timber would be the beginning of a whole new life for me. Joe immediately wanted to clear his land and start a farm, and I found my next big adventure. John Law had built a sawmill nearby, planning to use the water power from the canal to run it. Law was ready to sell, but there was one problem. We needed someone we could trust to help us with the work involved in running the mill. Luckily, our brother John was single and ready to leave England. He arrived in 1849 and helped me and Joe purchase the sawmill. Joe cut the timber, John ran the mill, and I directed my crew of hard-working Irishmen as we built our way upriver. It was hard work, but I enjoyed it. 1851 was a big year. Our daughter Nettie was born in Kokona, and I started another business venture. A group of landowners, including myself, built a plank road from Kaukauna to Menasha, and then charged folks a toll to ride on it. They loved it. It was a safe, smooth surface for travel, and it saved them tons of time. In 1853, we moved again. We followed that plank road that we built to Menasha, where we hoped to finally settle down. Our son, Morgan, was born that fall. It was a very difficult birth for Mary, and she never really recovered. Sadly, I lost her that September in 1854, and she's buried right next to me. My older girls were 16 and 18 years old, and they really helped a lot around the house, especially with the new baby. Around that same time, I met a young man who would play a pivotal role in my life, Bernard Mathewson. He was 18 and had come up from Georgia on the advice of his aunt who lived in Kaukauna. Bernard had no money but was a hard worker and ready to handle any project I threw at him. A few years later, Bernard's mother and some of his siblings came to Menasha after his father's passing. His mother, whose name was Mary, was beautiful. You can imagine my surprise when I found myself falling for her. Bernard became my stepson when I married Mary in 1858. In the midst of all of this happiness came tragedy, as it so often seems to do. Mary and I were so busy with the wedding that we didn't notice little Morgan had wandered off. He was just 5 and a tiny little thing. We found him later on the road. He had been hit by a wagon delivering wheat flour to our flour mill. I never got over his death, but was determined to push on with my life. After a few years, I found myself getting involved in yet another business venture. I helped round up some local investors, and we started the National Bank of Neenah in 1861. I was named its president. It was a good time for local investors, with the flour mills booming and new paper mills opening. I founded the Bank of Menasha a few years later. I found I had too many things going on, though, so my brother and I sold our sawmill, and after John's death in 1868, we had less involvement in the flour mill. Eventually, we sold that too. It was later converted into a paper mill, which got me thinking. Paper mills were doing so well in Neenah, couldn't we do the same thing in Menasha? So in 1875, I went in with a rich man from Canada and built the Hewitt and Scott paper mill in Menasha. I was committed to the Menasha community, so much so that I ended up staking everything I had on a company that was not even my own. Elijah Smith's pail and woodenware factory had been hugely successful, but it came into hard times in the 1870s. With massive debt, it had to close its doors and put over 300 men out of work. I was determined to get the company back on its feet, so I agreed to act as president until Elijah could turn things around. It took about a decade, but we did it. The debt was paid off, people were back at work, Elijah was back in charge. I'm very proud of that success. And in fact, that company is still around today. You all know it as Menasha Corps. Elijah and I ended up bonding over more than just business. His son married one of my granddaughters. But once again, tragedy hit on the heels of our success. My second wife, Mary, died of a heart attack after visiting her sister in 1878, and she's buried on my other side. After her death, our big house on the river suddenly felt empty. So my son helped me find a smaller place near St. Patrick's Church. As I got older, I found more time to spend with my children and my grandchildren. I had accomplished so much in the world of business, but in the end, it was the time with my family that I treasured the most. I ended up passing in 1897, and I'm still mad that I didn't make it into the new century. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoyed all the other stories here tonight. Thank you.